first of all, climate change, there's a couple of kind of, I think, dichotomies here. At one level, this is an intergenerational issue. Our grandchildren, the Horn of Africa, population growth, 4 years, 5 years of consecutive drought, and the fact that the science, it's gone beyond scientists, it's gone beyond the COP, it's now the law of the land. And very specific sectoral targets have been put in place. So no one decries, no one's a denier about this. But when it actually comes to it, there are viability and there are cost issues, and there are probably false deadlines insofar as targets are not going to be met. I think that's going to be the lesson of the next few years. It's easy to put the targets in place. It's harder to achieve them. So in terms of that and the built environment, and from your perspective, where do you think it's at right now? Is it real, and where will it impact on this audience? Yes? Each of you, but starting with Mary. Yeah.
I think climate change is very real. We have the Climate Action Act of 2021. There's going to be lots of plans being put in place. But the most important thing from a planning perspective is that we already have the National Planning Framework. That's in place. That has set targets. We're supposed to be concentrating most of our new building within the 5 cities in Ireland, which is obviously very important for this audience here. And if we can get that right, if we can focus on the brownfield sites, existing development, and put our new populations into there, then these areas become self-sustaining into the future. And that's really where population is going to go, and everything else will follow from that.
So, how detailed is that going to get going forward in terms of if you do a planning application for an office block, for an apartment block, are you going to have to do figures on embodied carbon? In other words, the actual construction of this is going to require X carbon.
Absolutely, and that's something that the planning system has been looking at over the last 10 years, in fact. Whenever serious discussions come around in relation to the demolition of city centre buildings, you have to make the case that what you're providing in place of that demolition is going to be more sustainable in the future. Now, to date, that has been relatively easy, because what you're doing is that not only are you removing a relatively inefficient building and replacing it with a more modern facility, we've also been going higher, so you're creating more space at the end of the day, more floor space. So that's sustainable in itself. The thing is that there are limits in terms of height, etc., that we can go, because it has real impacts on the environment around it. So it's very much a balancing act about providing for height, building efficiency, and making sure that the impacts don't offset the gains.
Okay. A lot of the focus is about the energy. What about biodiversity and nature?
Very important. What we have at the moment is called SUDS, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, and that is very much contributing to the provision of biodiversity within the built environment. The parks departments, the drainage departments, they're all very much focused on providing this. And also from the private sector perspective, if you're building an office building, etc., if you want to achieve platinum LEED, you have to provide for biodiversity, and it can be the vegetation, it can be your suds going in there, it can be bees on the roof. You know, we really are looking at changing the way that we're going to live in a city centre environment.
So don't cut the grass and do all the things.
All those positive things.
Okay. Right. Rachael, if I could ask you the same question. Like, in fairness, public officials are there to have a regulatory role, right? CBRE live in a different planet, which is someone's got to pay the shagging bills, viability is an issue, and the figures have got to add up. So we'll take, this is perfection, where is realism?
Yeah, so I think the government targets are definitely one thing and something that's spurred on a lot of action, but in terms of our clients, both the investors and the tenants, the big thing for them is that they've set their own net zero carbon targets. They've been quite public about that, so now it's down to them and their own public opinion to deliver that. So, and those targets are typically quicker than 2050. They might be 2030, 2035. And that suddenly kind of crystallizes everyone's thoughts a little bit. It's not way in the future, it's within this sale or with this property cycle or within this lease. So that, I think, there was a little bit of a quiet period through COVID, but now everyone's back in the market. There's definitely a lot more focus on ESG and how are we going to get something to happen within this cycle, within this lease. But I think there's been a lot of talk already today about retrofitting existing buildings and data, and that's definitely something we need to look at. But it's working with tenants and landlords, it's not something that needs to be done all at once. We've talked about how you could kind of completely deoccupy a building and completely retrofit it. But quite often the more cost-effective way to do that is to have a 5-year plan. What can you do over time with the tenants in place, maybe working around vacancies to improve the building over time and have a sort of 5-7-year plan for that rather than assuming you're going to have vacant possession and do everything all at once. You can work with your tenants to upgrade the lighting, even just starting with, do you know how much energy is the building using? Is there anything operational you can do? Quite often in slightly older buildings, you don't have a good idea of what your tenants might be doing in terms of energy use. Working together to see just what you can tune within the building before looking at capital spend on the building to have a plan over time to get towards net zero carbon that aligns with your tenants and your investors.
And in your opinion, who is driving this at a commercial level? So the law of the land, the regulations are fine. Is it that if you are a big PLC and part of your job is to knock on the door of big pension funds, bondholders, and raise hundreds of millions every year, and they're driving this agenda? Is it banks looking for term loans are going to drive it? Or is it some altruistic corporate mission statement internally?
I think the mission statement's sort of the dressing of it, but definitely within the European funds we see active in Dublin, it's linking back to their own ESG targets. They've committed to be net zero carbon and take actions, and they've got plans within their sort of investment decisions to meet these targets. That's the big push, that's what they're seeking when they're looking to buy and sell in Dublin, and then that's having a flow-on effect to the rest of the market. Part of it is what do tenants want in terms of the big corporates. They are looking for, they've got their own net zero carbon plans, so they're looking for sustainable workplaces. But the big pension funds who have their own ESG targets, they're taking those very seriously and looking to buy buildings that already have that, or looking to buy buildings as an opportunity to be upgraded. And that's just their own internal
And do you have
programs.
any understanding or empathy with SMEs who listen to all of what you just said and they say, okay, this is going to cost me money. This is another layer of compliance. I've enough red tape to be dealing with. It's not going to add as much to my bottom line as you may say, because my mission statement isn't being read by anybody. I don't need to raise funds in that sense. Can you understand the kind of resistance that's out there? It's not just resistance to change. There are actual costs, compliance barriers here.
Yeah, and I think that's probably definitely one sector of the market where government support is going to be really useful. I know that there's a programme at the moment between SEAI and the Irish Green Building Companies that's looking specifically at SMEs and building upgrades to try and unpick the opportunities and barriers. And there are other grants by the SEAI which probably focus more on residential and smaller businesses. So I think, when you haven't got the big funds and capital of the pension funds, I think SMEs probably will need some support, or even just guidance in terms of where do you start, what's the first thing you should do, and who can you ask to for advice?
Okay, Conall, I take it you have more of an engineering angle on this?
Yeah, more technical background, I suppose, and I think if you describe where we're at...
Are you an evangelist, though?
What?
Are you another of them?
Absolutely, yeah. Where we're at the moment, I think it's a bit like the start of the Dublin City Marathon, and the gun went about, 10 or 15 minutes ago, and some of Rachael's clients are heading up the track, and some people have sprinted off very early, and some people are getting to the line and looking around, and some people are still at the back and haven't crossed the starting line yet. And there's a whole range of ability. And what you find is some of the companies who have sprinted off very early and set net zero targets, we're going to be net zero by 2025, they're beginning to do the sums on that now, and they're realizing, God above, we're never going to make that. So companies as big as Microsoft are recalibrating and saying, let's take our time and think this through a little bit further. But then there are probably the companies where their shareholders and their investment matters more on their climate performance are the ones that are putting the most work and the most money behind it. I think where the first step in any process is figuring out where you're at. The runner might look at their watch and see how many kilometres they're doing or how many minutes it's taking and take stock. And the data that Owen described there, and actually figuring out the numbers and putting some intelligence into what your performance is and where you need to invest, that's the stage we need to get to. And then you move on from then and set your strategic targets and realize you cannot, it's very much a marathon, not a sprint. A lot of our targets are very much, we have to be doing this by 2030, or in reality it might take longer. It's a transformation that's going to take a couple of decades.
Therefore, Engineers Ireland are in the coalface of making this a reality.
Yeah.
How would you describe Engineers Ireland's attitude to this agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a mixed. There are some leaders who are really strong and want to rewrite our bylaws and who want to drive the sustainability agenda as quickly as they can. And there are some more traditionalists who are saying, well, take your time, or there's too much to take in. We're worried about safety already. We already have project management courses. The digitalization is a big challenge. So it's just another one challenge coming on top. What I think we haven't discussed maybe is the possibility of regulation to play a bigger role here. That for example, if you look at the London plan, so London would be maybe the leaders in terms of advancing planning narratives and being ambitious on things like biodiversity and climate change. So some of the targets they have for development in London would include, all big developments now have to have a circularity statement. So they're looking at circularity in design, not just recycling and where do your skips go, but how are you designing the building to be better used in the future. They're also looking for a mandatory carbon life cycle assessment on big developments. So that means you won't get planning.
It might be a help to have,
that.
EV charging points, which a lot of them don't have.
I think new developments do, but yeah, they're coming. So what I think on the regulation side, the other thing that's happening in the UK, and it will come here as well, is a big push for what they call a new Part Z of the building regulations. So at
Not
the moment,
another part.
Exactly. So you have Part M for access, you have your fire Part B, and the technical people in the room will be all too familiar with this. But what's being pushed for in the UK and is already happening in Scandinavia is a mandatory requirement to meet certain standards for embodied carbon. So that means if the materials you're using deliver a building that's too high per square metre, your carbon investment in that building is too high, that won't meet the standard and it won't be building code compliant. So we're just starting the process of talking about that here. That might be 3, 4, 5 years, but it is on the way, so that some companies will do it for financial reasons or for altruistic reasons, but the regulation is going to play a role in making sure everyone else does it as well.
And take something like, the SHD process has been replaced by the LRD process. And it now seems to be the case that even though the local authority mightn't have an eco-expert in the building, they require the applicant to go through all sorts of hoops to go get a report about that. Isn't that right?
Yes, but that's standard, and it has been standard for a number of years on any major development. Essentially, again, it's European driven.
Yeah.
And no permission really these days is granted, or that will stand judicial review.
Yeah, but I wasn't for it. What I'm saying is then, if the developer rings up the local authority and say, what precisely is it, the fauna, the flora, the slug, the insect, or whatever? Oh, we don't have anyone in this house, in the county hall, to do that.
Yeah.
It seems a bit rich.
It does. It depends on your planning authorities. Some planning authorities, like everyone else, are better provisioned in terms of that technical expertise. But most...
Like, it sounds a bit box-ticking to me.
I think the role of the ecologist in the public sector is slightly different from the role of the ecologist that is, say, working for a private developer.
Yeah.
Like, you would expect a private developer to employ their own, because, let's face it, nobody trusts each other in terms of what needs to be done. And when you have two professionals coming together, they will be able to go forwards and backwards in terms of ideas, etc., so they can arrive at a common understanding of what needs to be done. So I think you'll always have a situation where you will have private developers being, and I think correctly advised by private ecologists.
One of the bugbears of the construction industry has been Mr. Cousins and the OPR. And that is perhaps driven by a cultural thing that we should all live in cities, in apartments that have access to public transport, and it's a greener way of living as opposed to low-density sprawl. And this has led to county development plans being dezoned and all the rest of it. Does it make sense?
The single most important decision you make for any development is where to put it. So we've talked a lot about the structure and the fabric and how you heat it and so on, but it's where you put the building is the most important factor, because that's for the 50 or 100 years it's there. That's what dictates its energy use, its transport footprint. So you're going down the Naas Road and you're heading, you've got through the traffic, you pass by the Boland Naas, and then you pass by this big car park with the building. It's the Kerry Group headquarters. You know, it's probably a fantastic building, and it's great to see, you know, big company with an Irish-based headquarters, but you look at the car park and you say, is there any logical reason why that's there? Once that building was sited in that location, everyone who goes there probably has to travel by car. There may be a small amount of public transport use. So the location of a building or any development is the most important thing in terms of climate change and sustainability. So we're right to focus on it, and we're right not to continue to sprawl across the countryside, and we're right to try and do what they call transport-oriented development. So you're linking your train lines, development sites, building your schools and your parks in a compact area, or maybe just reusing existing assets.
But you see, if you're doing this from a desktop in the custom house, you might have one view of the world. But actually what you might be doing is killing every provincial town.
No, the life and death of the provincial towns is probably more about what we do at the town centres as opposed to going further out. And a lot of provincial towns are gridlocked. Towns with 10, 15, 20,000 people, there's no real reason we should have gridlock in a town that small, but we do because we built estates 2 or 3 miles out and everyone's driving. So we have to learn from the mistakes of the past, and we have to consolidate and bring things back to the centre.
So the question is, Rachael, where spatial planning meets this ESG agenda?
That's a tricky one, but I think while you were mentioning there, I think one of the things we could do better is designing for the future, in terms of we might design an office building or a residential building now for the needs of now, but can we our demographics are changing, the way we work are changing, so could we be more sustainable in designing buildings that are fit for future and actually flexible, so you could easily change from use types or different sizes of apartments, and design for changing needs and changing ways of being more sustainable rather than locking in everything at once.
Talk to me about Lego-like buildings. I suppose you're the engineer.
Yeah, I think if you had a child at home...
You're going to dismantle
absolutely.
the Lego. Here we go. Go on.
Like if you have a child at home and he or she builds with Lego, and imagine if every time they finished with the set, you said, okay, that's finished now, and you took a hammer to it and squashed down every brick and threw it in a bag and sent it off to China and say, well, they'll melt it down and make new bricks out of that. We don't do that. There's a more intelligent way, and that's make it disassemblable and make it so you can reconfigure it. So you can reconfigure the building internally, or you can take the components and reuse them and rebuild them. So the construction sector is moving towards a more off-site construction, assembly, and we need to take the next step then and think about disassembly, reconfiguration, but not to all the energy and effort that goes into making a component. It's not very intelligent just to crush that and maybe make it new concrete from it or burn it.
Where is this custom in practice?
Yeah, where it's at, this is still at the research stage in the university and EU-funded Horizon projects. They're talking about...
It's still a laboratory rat, is it?
It's still something that the Dutch and the Danes are probably doing, and we'll be doing in 10 years' time, hopefully.
Okay. But there's no project like it in Ireland?
Not yet. And I think the difficulty for commercial developers is if you want to invest in this and do the right thing, you just see the benefit maybe 40, 50 years' time when it comes to demolition or reimagining the use of the building, whereas we're probably more interested in getting it built now and making it profitable.
When we think of some of the finest architecture in this country, Gandon buildings across Dublin that'll, post-date all our this generation existence. I mean, is there not a merit in permanency?
Yeah, absolutely. And we should make sure if we're building modular and off-site that it's not going to be falling apart in 30 years, or we'll all feel a bit stupid.
It's not terrapins,
Exactly, but there's probably room for durability as well as this this Lego approach, and I'm sure you still have Lego sets from your youth, and they've lasted
Yeah.
fairly well. So.
Yeah, but this isn't play stuff. I mean, we're trying to make money here, and yeah, okay. Green leasing. Could you talk to me about green leasing? In other words, where, like, one of the things that I certainly did pay attention to today, Ivan, you won't be able to lease your property unless you've done this stuff. What is green leasing?
Yeah, so green leasing is sort of additions to standard leasing clauses where a tenant and a landlord might agree to either share information or improve the performance of the building together. There's been a couple of sort of events and movements in the Irish market at the moment. There's the Chancery Lane project that's working on standard clauses for the Irish market, and IPUT launched a report I think about a month or so ago about how they're promoting green leases. One of the issues we quite often have when we're doing energy audits or looking to improve buildings is the lack of communication between tenants and landlords on the performance of the building. They might just not know where the data is or not be willing to share it. So setting out in a green lease clause is just a really simple way of formalising that you will share information or work together on sustainability. So it's something that's it's an old idea, but something that's just coming to the market at the moment. I think some leasing agents might be a little bit nervous about anything additional in leases, but it's definitely something that...
Who polices it? Who says this is a green lease or it's not?
So there
is it the SEAI or who?
No, there's some guidance from sort of law bodies and some property industry, but it's just a legal clause that your solicitors would agree. A green lease would be something that would involve sustainability performance, and it can either be just sharing data or looking at information or agreeing together to improve the performance. But it's something that both sides of the agreement need to start getting used to and sort of briefing their lawyers that this is something that they want to do. And over time, as it gets more common in the market, it'll be easier to come to these sort of agreements.
And if all of this is government-led, EU government, national governments, what incentives are they putting in place? Take for retrofit where it's behind the curve. You know, you get $5,000 of a grant if you're buying an EV car. What sort of grants are available if you retrofit an apartment block or repurpose an industrial building?
Yeah, so at the moment, probably the biggest place to look for grants is to the SEAI, and there is an Exceed program that looks at very large users of energy and how you can, first of all, do an audit and a plan and then upgrade that property. The grants are of a size that it suits more industrial, larger energy users. I believe that they are working on programs in the commercial sector as well. There probably is a little bit of a gap on,
So there's SFA, is that what you're saying?
What's FSA?
Sweet something,
I've heard it's coming. But definitely within the Climate Action Plan, there are sort of line items that these sort of things are coming down the pipeline for us, but definitely something to watch.
Okay, please do get in your questions now, because this panel is going to come to a conclusion. There is a poll. Do you see sustainability being a core concern for your company now and in the future? Yes, no, not sure. And I don't have any fresh questions. I want to talk about storm damage and one of the, coastal erosion, flooding problems, flash flooding, and so on. Anyone like to take that in terms of if climate change is more extreme weather events, even though we have a fairly moderate and are not worst affected, is there any policy or other implications for the built environment from that?
I would say in relation to planning that we've been very concerned about flooding.
And floodplains.
And floodplains, because it has been a source of concern from the 1990s onwards with the major floods that happened, Hurricane Charlie, etc. And very much we have made decisions about where we're going to build, and if you're going to be building on a floodplain, because let's face it, most of our towns are located on floodplains, because our towns, what we need water for water supply, and we need to discharge our sewerage. So we need to be close to rivers, we need to be close to waters, and we need to make sure that we can build in these locations in relative safety and in the long term, and we're looking at in terms of rise of the seaboard and in terms of changes in relation to the weather, as you described.
So where we're dealing with, you wouldn't get planning for this today because it's on a floodplain. What's been done about vulnerable areas?
What's been done about vulnerable areas is that where you have new build, you're making sure that they're building at a high enough level so that if the floods do come, human life
It's
is
on
preserved.
stilts, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any experience with any of that?
Yeah, so particularly investors and owners with sort of ESG policies, some of them are starting to look at climate risk and climate risk assessments of their assets as well. They want to know that this might be okay year one, but in 20 years' time, how might that building
Because
responds to a
Sandy
changing
Mount
climate?
might be under 4
Yeah.
feet of water.
So there are.
Don't give $1 million for that.
There is mapping available to look at a certain location and what the future climate might be at that location in 20 or 50 years' time. So you can have a look at, predict whether the flood levels or river levels are going to be worse, storm events are going to be worse, or I think one of the other problems is just overheating. So our climate is getting warmer. There might be a building that's just about doing okay at the moment, but if it's got a lot of glazing, it might actually be too hot in 30 years' time. So with an existing building, it might be about managing the risk and retrofitting it rather than starting again or doing sort of anything too drastic. But having that look ahead to how the building might perform in 30 years' time, how that might affect its functionality and its value is something that investors are starting to look at.
And would that, because people tell me the biggest concern with the climate change is actually water and the availability of water globally. Does that feed into it? No?
Yep, so there's mapping of it, and I think you might have because it's all about probability and what might happen. You could have a location where the risk of drought has increased and the risk of sort of very heavy downpours has increased in the same place. So you have to have buildings that are responsive to both and can adapt to both. But there's, mapping available for a lot of different climate impacts.
How are engineers meeting these twin challenges?
For infrastructure projects now, that a climate resilience risk assessment is required. So if your Galway bypasses before on board Conall, there'll be an element in there looking at what kind of climate change scenarios have you looked at, and can the piece of infrastructure deal with it? I'm not so sure it's as rigorous maybe at individual building level. The patterns we seem to be looking at is what Rachael described. We'll have both longer, wetter periods, and we can just as easily have a higher risk of long, dry periods, which in some ways is at least predictable, or you can model them. But the extreme storms is probably something that we haven't taken enough account of. So when Carol Tallon earlier talked about cybersecurity risk and doing an assessment and thinking it through, there's a lot more work needed on climate resilience and climate risk assessment. And I suppose the key thing on resilience is just trying not to rely on one system. So if everything in a building is running on electricity, is there a backup generator, or is there a problem if the grid goes down? The grid doesn't go down very often, but if it does, will it be catastrophic, and have you got a plan B? And same for your other systems, your telecoms and everything else. So I think to try and reduce vulnerability is to try not to have all your eggs in one basket in terms of your technologies and your systems in your building.
Okay. I want to ask you all, I'm going to wrap up with the best bit of advice you'd like to give this audience facing into the decade. But I'd just like to ask you, Mary, about the consistency of local authorities. It struck me in this morning's discussion that there's a huge variable in terms of what individual local authorities are doing about cost rental, about affordable housing schemes, how they're reliant and have outsourced to approved housing bodies. What is the consistency? In some places I've heard pre-planning meetings are cancelled, they don't have staff. They write out for further particulars simply because they just don't have enough staff, acute staff shortages of specialist people. If the truth is told, do we have an even-handed, 30, 31 local authorities across the country? Is there a uniform approach to all this gamut of issues?
There isn't a uniform approach, as I think anyone in the hall here will tell you that they will have had different experiences between different planning authorities. Some planning authorities are better resourced than others. There is a real need for sharing of resources, a sharing of expertise. Our other major problem that we're looking to in terms of the Irish Planning Institute is the recognition that we have very few planners coming through, and the rest of the building industry is finding the exact same thing. It's a cyclical thing. When construction does well, planning, engineers, you get everyone into the business. When things go downhill, you get very few.
This is at third level education?
At third level education. So we need to be going out into second level and encouraging people to become planners, because facing forward into the future is going to be a major challenge for the whole industry. And in fact, for, if you like, Construction Ireland, it's really probably in 10 years' time, aside from the big issues in terms of climate, the other big issues are in terms of people and having the people there with the correct expertise.
The skills. Okay. Let's wrap it up then by asking each of you, and I'll start with you, Conall. You know this audience, you can see the attendee list over lunch and so on. From what you know, with your work in RPS, what's the best bit of advice you give this audience in relation to this whole environmental sustainability, climate change agenda?
Yeah, I think don't bury your head in the sand. If you haven't started to figure it out, start to figure it out for your own organisation. Don't get mesmerised with all the terminology or try to be a world beater straight away. Do some time thinking about what your impacts are and your footprint is, and then, you know, short, medium and long-term goals, and just work through it systematically, and just don't get dazzled, and don't try to be the person sprinting off, because they might fall by the wayside. So just some intelligent planning now is a good time for that.
Okay, excellent. Rachael?
Probably a similar idea, just figuring out your current performance using the data and get a good picture of your whole of building performance. It's only when you've got a good idea of that can you start planning out improvement plans or net zero carbon plans. So getting a picture of whole of building performance.
Mary?
Location, location, location. As everyone already knows, the important locations are within the existing built environment, and focus your attention there.
Okay, well, I've certainly enjoyed this discussion. Very informative. I hope you have too. Please show your appreciation for Conall, Rachael and Mary, please.